Kylie's book of folding. She dedicated her entire life to writing it. Furthering knowledge is the most noble work of humankind, Gale. Remember that.
How is a centuries-dead mathematician one of the most active and important characters in Foundation? When they keep showing up to guide the mastermind behind the Foundation's entire plan, you tend to pay attention. This is Calais, the show's most enigmatic character, and a single brief flash of red in Season 3 all but confirms her true nature, opening a galaxy's worth of new possibilities. Book fans have had their theories for years, but the latest season is bringing everyone closer to the truth. In the Season 2 premiere of Foundation, Harry Seldon's consciousness is trapped inside the Prime Radiant, a device he constructed by utilizing Calais' ninth proof of folding. He was transferred there by Gale Dornick after being inadvertently sentenced to 138 years of solitary confinement in the data storage device in the handle of Rachel's knife. In the Prime Radiant, he encounters a vision of his life partner Yana Seldon when he notices she's using a strange speech pattern rather than talking like the woman he loves. The vision changes into Calais. Fool Harry Seldon once, shame on you. Fool him twice, and well, he doesn't believe this vision he's talking to is a reincarnation of the dead mathematician either. I'll come back around to that and to Una's world and the revelations there in a few minutes, but I wanted to take a look at how they've been using this character throughout the series, because when she appeared in the third episode of the second season, it was apparent that wouldn't be the last time we see her. As far as spoilers, if you're caught up with the show, you should be okay since this isn't something that was pulled directly from the books. As more information has emerged about the character, having read all the relevant books from Asimov, it would be impossible for my thinking on where things are going not to be influenced by that. Still, I'll be making an effort to present things through the lens of what's been on the screen while focusing on the show's logic. Above all, I won't be spoiling future plot points from the books. We first hear the name Calais in the first episode of the first season, which is a big tip-off to her importance. When Gale arrives on Trantor to meet Harry for the first time, one of the first things he asks her about is Calais' ninth proof of folding. Gale used it to solve the Abraxas conjecture, a problem that had gone unsolved for centuries. Her solution won a contest that Harry put together, and she was invited to Trantor as a result. Calais' proof was the key to her solution, and this impresses Harry because in 500 years, none of the traditional scholars thought to use it. This is because Calais' writing is poetic. Gale says it's beautiful, but it's hard to imagine there's any rigor there. This brings up the question of why Gale was drawn to Calais' work and how she discovered it on her home planet Synax. You see how that happened in a flashback in the 5th episode. In that, you learn that Synax was dying from the overmining of volcanic vents, leading to melting ice caps, rising ocean levels and temperatures. When warnings of the man-made environmental disasters started to circulate, the religious population turned to their faith leaders, who eventually called for an event called the Cleanse, where universities were burned, the study of math and science was banned, and scientists and scholars were labeled as heretics and in some cases put to death. They viewed the rising ocean as a warning from their god, the Sleeper, a challenge that they had to overcome in order to prove worthy of his awakening. Gale was an acolyte in the Seer Church at this time who had conflicted feelings about her faith. In her role, she discovered the teacher Aaron Sorn breaking into his condemned university to rescue books that would be lost in the Cleanse. He speaks the truth about what's happening as they talk because he knows she understands. He offers her Calais' book of folding and says that furthering knowledge is the most noble work of humankind. She pleads with him to run, but he won't. He's captured by her fellow acolytes and put to death by drowning in a public ceremony that Gale takes part in. Later, she returns to the site to recover Calais' book from under the waves and begins to teach herself math. And of course, that will lead to her solving Abraxas and meeting Harry on Trantor. That seems like a pretty good use of the character. And after Gale's origin story flashback, I wasn't expecting to see her again. Fast forward to Harry's interment in the Prime Radiant in Season 2, which I brought up at the beginning of the video. When he's talking to Yana, he notices she's speaking in what's called an anapestic trimede, which makes him remember Gale's mention of Calais' poetic writing when they first met. This is a very specific and rare style, so he realizes this is who he must be talking to. The connection is that he designed the Prime Radiant with Yana using Calais' formulations. That all makes sense as a way for him to figure out where he is, but it doesn't really explain how or why he's talking to dead people. He believes she has to be something new, and the vision or manifestation or whatever you want to call it encourages this line of thinking. After some internal debate, he settles on the idea that she's the embodiment of the Prime Radiant itself, which contains parts of Yana and Calais because of their contributions. It doesn't really make sense based on what he knows about the object he built, which he describes as an adaptive, predictive, four-dimensional model that takes in data and learns, but that's different from having self-awareness or an inherited memory of either woman. Callie waves us away, saying that his work was always incomplete and maybe she represents its completion. Again, this is a reasonably sensible way to utilize the character. It highlights the connection between Harry and Gale, frees Harry from the prison she put him in, and provides a little backstory on how he developed this plan. This could be the end of her involvement, but it isn't, because when he figures out how to escape, she asks him to meet her on Una's world before he leaves. As he is wont to do, he keeps this a secret and surprises Gale and Salvor by taking the beggars to Una's world rather than to Ignis, where they thought he was hoping to start the second foundation. Instead, he walks to a structure called the Monuments of Industry with Gale and finds Callie waiting for him. Here, she's not a vision, but instead appears as a person who is able to take Harry's consciousness or his digital form and sustain it. And just to make sure we know that she's not an apparition or something like what appeared to Harry inside the Radiant, the show makes a point of having the first thing she does when she greets them be holding out her hand to Gale and showing them share a handshake, and she can do more than that. Because at the end of the episode, when the mining machines are pursuing them, the scanners discover another human on Una's world that turns out to be Harry. We don't see how it happened, and he doesn't know either, but Callie was able to take his consciousness and put it into a body that looks exactly like he did before he died. This brings cloning to mind, which we associate with Demerzel and therefore with robots. There are a couple of other details that are essential here. Harry told Gale the story of how the Empire used the mining machines to extract all the resources on the planet and then turned them on the population when those were exhausted. This explains why they woke up and tried to attack them, and why, when the beggar got away, they started to go after this new version of Harry. It also hints that Callie is not a human because, as far as we can tell, they aren't interested in her. This means that Una's world is a pretty good place for a non-human entity to set up shop because they can conduct their work in peace while having the extra layer of protection that prevents anyone from stumbling onto their hiding place. The other detail that's there is that Harry tells Gale that Una's world's palladium was exhausted 3,000 years ago. This brings to mind Brother Day talking about Emperor Hanlo in episode 2. He told Demerzel that her dynasty began 4,000 years ago and lasted for 2 millennia, which means that her family was in power while the mining and subsequent slaughter of workers took place. The only non-human entity that we've met so far is Demerzel. She was introduced as the last of the humaniform robots, with the rest of her kind all being wiped out during the Robot Wars. Based entirely on what we've seen on Una's world, the most obvious explanation is that Callie is a robot too. When showrunner David Escorier went on my friends Aaron and Jim's Foundation podcast over at Bald Move, he told them that the Robot Wars happened approximately 5,000 years before the pilot, and this was confirmed in the show when we learned about Demerzel's imprisonment towards the end of season 2. This means that there shouldn't have been any humaniform robots involved with the mining operation because, remember, they made a point of saying that was going on 3,000 years ago. Hence, no robot involvement means there wouldn't be any stragglers left behind. Theoretically, Demerzel could have been there, and that might explain why she lingered to look at the mural of Emperor Hanlo, but either way, she's been in Trantor in service to the Cleons for the past 400 years. I also don't think she's being dishonest when she says she's the last of her kind. I don't believe that's through, but I believe that she believes it is. This is important because by the end of season 2, there was still a lot we didn't know about robots in the show's universe based on what it showed us. But we did learn more about how Demerzel ended up serving the Empire exclusively. We also received an edited account of the Robot Wars conflict from Brother Dusk before he discovered the prison beneath the palace where Demerzel was held years. Upon discovering that, they got a detailed account from a holographic Cleon the First, explaining how he altered Demerzel's programming so that a law to serve him and his clone dynasty would supersede her previous directives. Why does that matter in a video about Calais? Well, as mentioned in the intro, the red flash we first saw in Calais' eyes in the second episode of Season 3 was later repeated when Demerzel met Gale in Episode 6. This not only pretty much confirms that Calais is a robot and connects the two characters, but also elevates the question of why Demerzel doesn't know she exists to the top of the show's list of mysteries. So far, Calais' direct involvement in the third season is limited to a scene that lasts less than 2 minutes. While it only amounts to a brief encounter, it presents loads of potentially crucial details. In the scene, we see her waiting for Harry, who had grown old after staying awake for decades to teach psychohistory to the Second Foundation. Reaching the end of the life cycle of the body Calais provided for him, she calls out his choice to lie to Gale, something he justifies by making excuses. He couldn't look her in the face and say goodbye, saying it's better that way, which I suppose it is for him. But as she points out, Gale would probably disagree. Then she checks to see if Harry's sure about his decision, adding that there'd be grace in dying on Ignis, confirming that this isn't the first conversation they've had since he was trapped in the Radiant. Harry makes a final plea to have her take him back to Una's world and give him another reprieve, requesting a new body, and she turns him down, saying this body was his reprieve and he did all he could while he had it. That being the case, he's certain he wants to go with her, and from there she activates what I believe is best described as a portal. As they walk over to it, he says, "No spacers, no whisper drive, no jump gate, how?" And she responds that if he comes with her, she'll show him. This last part indicates that she's working with technology beyond anything the Empire or the Foundation has, and that this isn't him passing into the afterlife. The portal is taking them to a real place in the galaxy. When this episode first aired, I felt so sure where this was all leading in relation to the books that I didn't even look that closely at the portal. Then I noticed a comment on my video saying that it looked like our moon, and sure enough, if you pause it just before they cross the threshold, I could see how you could make a case for that. This is also where we see the red light flash in her eyes just before she activates it. It all adds up to a super powerful robot character operating in the shadows, and that's not the most interesting thing that comes out of the scene. That comes when Harry, recalling an earlier comment Salvor made on Ignis, asks Calais why someone wanted him to have skin in the game. Calais cryptically replies, "Because we can't," using "we" as notable, and her statement suggests Calais and possibly others allied with her are unable to directly intervene or have skin in the game, hinting at a specific limitation or directive. Two words that make you think of Demerzel, adding another reason that we should look at what we learned about robots from her Season 3 scenes to understand better what might be going on with Calais. Before we get into that, I think it's worth mentioning that Brother Dawn's arc this season started off with a quest to the Imperial Library to learn about Calais' equations. This was more about showing how the Second Foundation's influence is operating in the background and putting him on a path to team up with Gale. But it's another example of Calais' influence permeating through the story. What's likely more important is that through her unburdening sessions with Zephyr Vorellus, Demerzel gave us a formal introduction to the laws of robotics, the original 3 laws that all robots in Asimov's writing are designed with, and the Zeroth law that Ardenil Olabaugh and Argisgard Reventlov developed and incorporated into their programming. I've got a whole video on Demerzel and Zanil and Giscard to a lesser extent, so I don't want to rehash all of that here. The key points that are important for understanding Calais are encapsulated in what Demerzel says to the Zephyr, and since we're talking about the robots, The garden she chose as the setting for these sessions is also worth a mention. They sit in front of the last remaining apple tree from an orchard where humans who supported robots were executed. The golden apples are poisonous because liquid iridium from destroyed robot bodies seeped into the soil. While the obvious connection is that the tree is the last of its kind, as Demerzel thinks of herself, there are similarities between the level of violence that took place here and what happened to the workers on Una's world. It seems like robots in the show like to spend their alone time reflecting at sites where mass casualty events took place. In a way, this actually ties into the zeroth law, which supersedes the original 3 laws of robotics. It says no machine may harm humanity or through inaction allow humanity to come to harm. Demerzel explains that determining what harms humanity as a whole is far more complex than what would harm an individual. She notes that some robots couldn't metabolize this new programming, but those that could realized drastic action was needed for humanity's survival because humans aren't great at helping them in this endeavor. To her, we almost seem to want extinction, and the zeroth law robots couldn't let that happen, not even through inaction. Considering that Calais appears to help facilitate Harry's development of the Foundation, it's a safe bet to put her in the same category. This seems to be further reinforced by the revelation that Demerzel helped Harry by providing him with data, even though she's bound to protect the dynasty at all costs. The only caveat is that Demerzel reveals that the robots went to war with each other over how to interpret and act on the zeroth law regarding humanity's fate. This contradicts Brother Dusk's previous story that the robots fought against humans for personhood, which remember was an edited memory likely implanted to obscure what really happened. She mentions that a robot killing an important man in service of the zeroth law sealed the robot's fate, which differs from Dusk's claim of a robot killing Emperor Benefoss, somehow bypassing the first law, which shouldn't have been possible, as the start of the conflict. You could take the idea that there were 2 factions as a hint that Demerzel and Calais will wind up being on opposite sides of that split, but I don't think it's likely. Demerzel's Season 3 story keeps highlighting her limited options and the inflexibility of her altered directive to serve the dynasty. Psychohistory's core prediction is that it will come to an end, and soon. So I don't like the idea of her being freed only so that a second round of the robot wars can happen. If you check the fan-made Asimov wiki, you might accidentally stumble upon details about the zeroth law robots from the second Foundation trilogy. Although these are considered canon due to the Asimov estate's involvement in creating them, they're written by different authors and they significantly expand the story in ways that alter it. I've never read them, so I can't comment on the quality of the individual stories the 3 authors wrote. From the summaries I've read, they fill in some details about Harry's development of psychohistory and what Daniil was up to at that time. You might come across some of these details if you try to search for Foundation Robot Wars. The book Foundation in Chaos, written by Greg Bear rather than Isaac Asimov, features a robotic civil war. Because this is a concept the show also introduced pretty early in its run, David Goyer was asked directly if he was adapting or even pulling some details in from that series. He answered on more than one occasion that he hadn't read them and hadn't planned to, so as far as I know, there's no reason to look to them for answers for what's happening in the show. Also, this idea of Harry having skin in the game since the robots can't seems in line with how Demerzel describes the zeroth law. Powerful robots making difficult decisions in the service of the greater good rather than any individual human. We can look at decisions she made as Empire's guardian, things like the Starbridge attack, as examples of the extreme measures that might be necessary if you swapped out Empire for humans. An oversimplified description of the difference between a 3 laws robot and a zeroth law robot is that the former is a servant and the latter is a steward. The show introduced another layer with the idea of conflict over how to best interpret and act on the zeroth law, but the robots' connection to the Foundation seems more important than anything else. That's what the story's about, and the way that both Calais and Demerzel are connected to the Radiant is where I think you can start to see what the show's setting up. Baldharry gave Demerzel his because knowing the Empire will end is one thing, but holding it in your hands is different. She believes he wanted to force her to see the fall firsthand, compelling her to live in this paradox. Even being presented with visual proof that the Empire's end is inevitable, her compulsion to serve it remains unchanged. This shows that Cleon's law effectively cuts her off from the Zeroth law. Technically, it's still there, and there may be something to what Varela said about looking for loopholes to circumvent her current directive, but as revealing her face later shows, this isn't something she can allow herself to entertain. I believe that if it's happening, it would almost need to be occurring on an unconscious level, and essentially an artifact of her adoption of the Zeroth. Her inability to bypass the directive to serve Empire could also be why there have been so many references to other robots in the third season. We had her telling a young 24 that if she were free, she would make others of her kind, she'd make more robots, and that she understands connection, and explaining the clasp, the way that robots would come together to share everything when he's older in the present-day timeline. It stands out that the radiance she has, which adds all this additional internal conflict, comes from Baldharry, who learned last season that he was the left hand, kept in the dark by the Second Foundation. At the same time, Calais operates behind the scenes, working directly with the version of Harry that guides them. It is until their confrontation on Gale's ship that Demerzel understands that the Second Foundation is what has been causing the shadows in the math she observed in the Prime Radiant. Beyond the red flash in her eyes, which as mentioned connects her directly to Calais, one of the biggest revelations from their encounter for me was how much Demerzel, whom we think of as this advanced being that's always one step ahead of everyone, doesn't know about what's going on. And I brought up the Second Foundation trilogy because I found that information when the show first introduced the idea of the Robot Wars. I had just reread all of the Robot and Foundation books before the first season aired, because at that time it had been decades since I read some of them. So I was like, wait a minute, none of this happened in the books. I've seen some comments on my videos recently that appear to be influenced by some of those concepts. But 3 seasons into this TV series, I think we have a pretty good idea of how they like to craft their stories. They like a twist, and more specifically, they want to show you something happening, but then reveal an additional detail that totally recontextualizes what it means. There are numerous examples of this, but one no one forgets is Cleon the 17th destroying Terminus. Yes, at the end of the episode, the Foundation's home planet is destroyed.